Now, I'm no huge Anne of Green Gables fan, but I'll guarantee you this much. You have seen this industrial complex on that Anne of Green Gables show. You've probably seen it on numerous movies, television ads, all over the place. It's because it is such a uniquely preserved environment. It's kind of like stepping into this weird Charles Dickens world. And that's what makes it so cool to come here and look at things. There's over 45 buildings preserved on this site, and the city, along with private developers, are in the process of trying to create new uses for this area. So one day, probably not too far in the future, it'll be a really vibrant part of the city.
This stone, which still sits on the Gooderham Worts site and bears a plaque telling its story, represents the start of the business over 170 years ago. In 1831, the stone was brought to York, as Toronto was then called, by a Scottish miller named James Worts. At that time, Toronto was a small but growing settlement made up of modest structures and a few church spires. There's a story of a man out hunting, running into James Worts in the secluded, overgrown shoreline at the east end of the harbor. The hunter thought it was strange that James Worts should be so far from town, but not be hunting or fishing. It turned out Worts was looking for the best place to build a windmill to power a grain mill that he intended to build. By 1832, Worts had erected his windmill at the eastern end of the harbor. One of the tallest structures in the area, it was for many years a prominent landmark along the waterfront. By the time the windmill was complete, James Worts had been joined by his brother-in-law, William Gooderham, another recent immigrant to Canada. This is the founding of Gooderham and Worts. Tragedy struck the business, however, when James Worts' wife died in childbirth. This sad event was only compounded when, broken by despair, James Worts drowned himself in the well on the mill site. With his partner and brother-in-law dead, William Gooderham adopted James Worts' son. In time, this orphaned boy would join the company and bring the Worts family back into the business. In 1839, Gooderham had started distilling spirits at the mill, and by the time the younger Mr. Worts signed on, distilling was replacing milling as the mainstay of the business. The east end of the harbor was often busy with schooners docking at Gooderham Worts. From the 1850s onward, Toronto was increasingly well connected by railroad to the outside world, and this helped Gooderham Worts expand even more. More business brought more buildings. One of the most impressive buildings was the stone mill, which still stands today despite being ravaged by a terrible fire in 1869. Apparently, Gooderham had built the mill of stone with the idea of fire safety, and apparently he was right. When the soaring flames that lit up the Toronto sky finally subsided, only the thick exterior stone walls were still left standing. He lost no time, however, in rebuilding the floors, ceilings, and roof. At this point, the company was so big that it could not afford to lose any production time. Over the years, Gooderham Worts grew to be one of the largest distilling companies in the world. The Trinity Street site resounded with the rattle of horse and buggy delivery carts, railroad whistles, and boat horns. Gooderham Worts products were shipped all over the world. Despite changing times and prohibition, the company continued to thrive into the 1900s. In 1929, it merged with Hiram Walker, another distiller that had began in Windsor, Ontario. By the 1980s, changes in the industry had finally caught up with Gooderham Worts. Yet while it has been closed as a distillery for some years, it remains one of the most complete and compelling industrial properties in Canada.
Now, I think out of all the buildings here at Gooderham Worts, the most prominent one is this one. It's the one you can really see from the Don Valley Parkway. It's the old grist mill, and it was built in 1860 to the designs of a man named David Roberts, and it really is a classic mid-19th century mill building. Built of limestone with wonderful masonry here. It's got a lot of small windows in it, as big as they could make at the time, trying to bring light in so, it's easier to work by. Now, what's interesting is David Roberts Sr., who designed this, had a son named David Roberts Jr., and that guy actually became a kind of court architect for the Gooderham family and designed most of their houses. He also designed a very famous building for the Gooderhams here in Toronto, the Flatiron Building. So kind of a neat connection and a wonderful old structure. Now another wonderful building at Gooderham Worts here is the Still Building, this one right behind me. Built in 1889, so what, about 110 years ago? But what's the most interesting thing, as an industrial building, you can see that they're bending over backwards to maximize the amount of glass that they can get into this thing. And glass is a really big deal, because glass, of course, brings light. And this thing, built when it was, about 110 years ago, is almost just as old as the very first steel buildings. And that's the steel structure that changed the world. All our skyscrapers downtown, the reason they're all curtain walls of glass is because they're steel. This one, they're still using traditional methods of building it up brick by brick, as far as I can see, and then trying to squeeze as much window as they can into it. But it's a limited technology, and they did their best. I think the thing that makes this complex, Gooderham Worts, so interesting is that it's almost all brick. So you walk around and everywhere you look there's that reddy clay brick color. And it comes from the great days of brick making too. Even the street that runs down here, Trinity Street, becomes brick inside this complex. So there's wonderful archwork, there's wonderful sort of details and corbelling details up at the roofs. It's really quite a great example of 19th century brickwork. Well, that's Gooderham Worts, a great collection of 45 excellent examples of 19th century industrial architecture. And now it's not always easy to get as close as we have today, so I sure hope you've enjoyed seeing some of these buildings right up front and close. And the other thing is, next time you're watching TV or a movie or even a TV commercial, keep an eye out, because they use this place way more than you can imagine. And you'll be sitting there watching TV and you go, hey, I know that. It's Gooderham Worts. Like, yeah, do they have table service here or what? No, I don't. You know, like, it's supposed to be a distillery, right? Like, what does someone have to do to get a drink around here?